Thank you, Michelle. So as Michelle mentioned, I'm the editor of the Journal of Physical Activity and Aging. So when Michelle asked me to do this talk, I went back to the most recent issues to try to find the kind of the hot topics internationally for research in aging. And this is what I came up with. Kind of the most popular submissions are dealing now with sedentary behavior in older adults. And also a lot of, it's a multidisciplinary journal, so it involves a lot of qualitative but also quantitative but also qualitative research. So there's a lot of qualitative research on the effect of built environments on physical activity. So I'm trying to combine both of those kind of hot topics into a revised title here, How to Alleviate Sedentary Behavior by Improving Built Environment. So this is the outline for my talk. So first I'll speak to sedentary behavior in older adults and how it affects health outcomes, and also some limitations to the research. And then on the environmental barrier section, I'll talk about barriers to increasing physical activity and reducing sedentary behaviors that deal with the built environment. So first, the definition of sedentary behavior. So it's any waking behavior in a seated or reclining posture with low energy expenditure. So they define the low energy expenditure as less than 1.5 metabolic equivalents. And it's important to note that this is waking behavior, so it doesn't include sleep, which, as you probably know, is becoming more of a topic with regards to healthy outcomes across the 24-hour time span. Older adults engage in about 9.4 hours per day in sedentary activities, and this is from a systematic review across 10 different countries. So it's the age group with the highest level of sedentary activity, and also the age group with the lowest level of moderate to vigorous physical activity. So they're the ones that are least likely to meet the physical activity guidelines, and they also have very high levels of sedentary activities. So the next few slides I have are I've taken from a summary of these two review articles that were recently published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine. And just to point out, I'm doing it the wrong way there, sorry. Went backwards. Check the pointer here. Oh, yeah. Just point out that these were CSEP sponsored consensus meetings. And this was at the World Congress on Activity and Aging, yeah, held in Melbourne that Michelle mentioned. And just to point out that we have two of our CSEP members here, Shipla Dogra and Jennifer Copeland, who are also on the editorial board of the Journal of Physical Activity and Aging. So they were leaders with this group. So from those reviews, they showed that the sedentary behavior of the health outcomes in older adults, the best associations are with obesity, cardiometabolic health, and physical function, along with mortality. And then there's less evidence for an effect of increased sedentary behavior on, and do that again, sorry, on cancer, pulmonary disease, stroke, mobility, cognitive function, mental health, and incontinence. So there's some evidence here, but it's just weaker than the evidence for these health outcomes. So, I went into one of the larger studies that looked at metabolic health, because this seems to be most affected by sedentary behavior. And so just to give you a kind of a quick definition of the metabolic syndrome, I'm sure this is familiar to a lot of you, but this is the International Diabetes Federation definition. It's 3 or more of having high waist girth, high triglycerides, low high-density lipoproteins, high blood pressure, and high blood glucose. So a combination of these risk factors is synergistic for increasing your risk of type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. One of the bigger studies that looked at sedentary behaviors and its association with metabolic health in older adults was from Gardner et al. You can see they looked at close to 2,000 older adults, and they found that the odds ratio for metabolic syndrome, when they're comparing the highest to the lowest quartile of TV watching, it was 1.42, and this was the same across males and females. And it's higher when they look at overall sitting time, so 1.56, and it was 1.56 in males and 1.57 in females. And when they broke it down by the components of the metabolic syndrome, they showed that TV time was related to decreased HDL and elevated glucose in women, and then sitting time was related to increased triglycerides in men and women, increased waist girth in women, and decreased HDL in men. So I pulled a couple of figures out of their paper, and I like these ones because it shows, just across the quartiles of overall sitting time. So the higher quartile here is the higher sitting time. I've put the cutoffs for the quartiles up here, just to show you which quartiles were significant compared to this first quartile. So on this graph, you have the odds ratio for metabolic syndrome. As I mentioned, you've got the quartile for sitting time across the bottom. And they've for each quartile, they have figures for the individuals that were meeting the physical activity guidelines, so that were performing 150 minutes or more per week of moderate to vigorous physical activity. And then they've got the black squares representing those that don't meet the guidelines. So as you're probably aware, with a lot of the sedentary behavior research, they show that for the most sedentary group, even if they're meeting the physical activity guidelines, they still have a significantly higher risk compared to the reference group. So these asterisks represent a significantly higher risk compared to this lowest group down here, which is the group with the least sedentary behavior and the ones that are meeting the guidelines. So this is for overall sitting time. And a lot of these studies separate overall sitting time from TV watching time. So, this is a similar graph, just looking at the quartiles of TV watching time. And they think that TV watching time is kind of the worst sedentary behavior because it involves less activity breaks compared to other sedentary behaviors. You're sitting on the couch for longer periods of time, especially with like Netflix, no commercials, and TV watching is associated with bad eating behaviors as well. So again, you can see that the groups that were significantly different, this is groups that were watching greater than or equal to 2 hours a day of television based compared to the lowest group here. So since this is a physiology conference, I'm mandated to show a busy physiological mechanism slide, so that's what I have upcoming for you here. So this is from a review article that I was able to do with Pierre Gertrude from Laval University. So sedentary behavior leads to muscle atrophy, and this leads to muscle is the greatest glucose consuming organ in the body, so it leads to a smaller sink for glucose. You have decrease in hexokinase activity, so it's the enzyme that's important for phosphorylation of glucose and trapping it inside muscle. So again, it's important for delivery of glucose to muscle. You've got decreased glucose transport proteins in muscle, so again, important for getting glucose inside the muscle. Decreased mitochondrial enzymes involved in glucose oxidation, and all these factors lead to a buildup of blood glucose and development of glucose intolerance over time. Then you also have a decrease in the enzymes involved in fat oxidation, increased fat storage, which can lead to lipid abnormalities. So, these are the important components of the metabolic syndrome. So some of the limitations from the sedentary behavior research that were identified, so most studies are cross-sectional, And so there's this concept of reverse causality where, it's unsure whether the poor health is a consequence of sedentary behaviors or whether people are sedentary because they have poor health to begin with. So that's a definite limitation. And then there's a lot of measurement issues as well. So most studies are based on questionnaires. And when the questionnaires are compared to more objective measures of sedentary behavior, they're found to consistently underestimate the amount of sedentary behavior that's reported. So the more objective measures include the use of accelerometers and inclinometers. So accelerometers, will allow you to assess the different epochs of levels of physical activity throughout the day, whereas inclinometers allow you to assess the amount of time that's spent in different postures, so lying down, sitting versus standing. So the limitation of these objective measures is they're less feasible to use in large population studies, so that's where you probably have to use the questionnaires. So other limitations, some sedentary behaviors might be beneficial for cognitive health. So if you think about sitting down and reading a book or playing the piano versus something like TV watching, which is more passive. So some of these more cognitive engaging sedentary activities might be beneficial for older adults. And sedentary behavior, as I mentioned, under the definition that it should exclude sleep. So, given this concept that, the increased realization of the importance of sleep and not only moderate to vigorous physical activities, but also light physical activities throughout the day. As you know, that CSEP released these new guidelines for children and youth, so from the ages of 5 to 17, and it combines the 4 different important categories for the 24-hour day. It's moderate to vigorous physical activities, light intensity activities, sleep behavior, and of course reduction in sedentary behavior. So one of the goals of CSEP in the near future is to expand these guidelines and make 24-hour guidelines for adults and older adults. And a big limitation is just there's a lack of intervention studies, so randomized controlled trials that evaluate health-related outcomes that are associated with interventions that reduce sedentary behavior. So, my look at the literature, there's only a handful of studies that actually look at health outcomes in younger adults, so a lot of workplace interventions, like, using standing desks or treadmill desks. And with that group, there's only, as I mentioned, a handful of studies that look at, say, metabolic outcomes. With the older adult population, there's even a less number of studies. So the one study that is out there just recently, and this is from the Journal of Aging and Health, you can see it involved a relatively small number of individuals, 38. They were randomized to 2 groups. So one group was counseled to sit less, so reduce their sitting time by about 1 hour per day. And the other group was counseled on getting active, so meeting the physical activity guidelines, performing 150 minutes per week of moderate to vigorous physical activity. It was a 12-week intervention. Their compliance was really good. It was 100%. They didn't have any dropouts. The intervention involved using an exercise physiologist to counsel patients throughout the 12 weeks on either sitting less or increasing their physical activity levels. And they were given a sense-aware armband to wear that was connected to a Bluetooth and a smartphone, technology that I'm completely unfamiliar with. So the participants were able to track and keep their physical activity levels or their sedentary time to make sure that they were meeting these goals. You see the outcomes included the short physical performance battery, body weight, and health-related quality of life. So short physical performance battery. It includes 3 different categories of tests. It involves a sit-to-stand test. So it's a timed ability to do 5 sit-to-stands from a chair. It includes some static balance testing with different foot positions. And it also includes a timed short walking test, so gait speed. And all those are put into a composite score out of 12. These are the results here. So overall, it showed that for the battery of tests, which I have graphed here, so this is improvement in the composite score over the intervention. The group that was counseled to sit less actually had a better improvement in function compared to the Get Active group. And then when they broke it down by the components, you can see that the improvement was from the chair stand test, which they mentioned in the discussion section that was evidence of specificity of training. They were told to sit less, so they improved in this chair stand test. Non-significant improvement in balance compared to the Get Active group, and you can see that there wasn't any difference in the real difference in the 4-meter walk time. The Get Active group did have a benefit for losing body weight compared to the Sit Less group, so they lost about 0.8 kilograms compared to a gain of 0.4 kilograms for the Sit Less group. And then in the quality of life measurements, the Sit Less group had an improvement in the component related to pain. And again, in the discussion section, they mentioned that this might be due to improved posture by sitting less, improved circulation. My research interests are in physical activity, but also I work a lot with nutrition people at our university. So I was interested in seeing this study, and this is with younger adults, but I think this would be a good study to replicate in older adults. So this uses a nutritional combined with activity break intervention for sedentary behavior. So it's a controlled study it's a crossover study where they had people come into the lab and they sat for 4 hours at a time, and then throughout the 4 hours they had their blood glucose measured, and they looked at area under the curve for their blood glucose response. And they had 4 different conditions, which I've tried to outline the abbreviations here. So they had a low glycemic index breakfast that they ate before this 4 hours of sitting. So low glycemic index foods, they're foods that result in a low blood glucose response, so a slow digestible carbohydrate, something that has a lot of fiber, as opposed to a high glycemic index food that might be composed of, say, simple sugars that result in a fast, a rapid rise in blood glucose. So they looked at a low glycemic index breakfast, a high glycemic index breakfast, and then they also had the combination of activity breaks during this 4 hours of sitting. So the activity breaks were 2 minutes of walking every 20 minutes throughout the 4 hours. So the bottom line here is that when they measured the blood glucose area under the curve for these different interventions, as they predicted, the group that did the best was the low glycemic index group that did the active breaks. And they found that the active breaks and the low glycemic index breakfast were additive for reducing the blood glucose area under the curve for the 4 hours of sitting. So again, it's something that I think could be replicated in older adults. And I've got some research again with the nutrition people at our university, just showing that low glycemic index diets are beneficial for reducing some of the metabolic risk factors in older adults. So this is, I forgot to put the reference on this, so it's from the British Journal of Nutrition, 2012. I'll give you a couple of minutes to write that down. So, and the pulse-based diet, it refers to low glycemic index foods that are from pulse-based plants, so it includes your non-oilseed legumes like lentils, chickpeas, beans, peas. There's a lot of funding out in Saskatchewan for this type of research because we're the leading exporters of lentils in the world. And that's something I've learned since I moved there. One of the research needs identified in the Dogra and Copeland reviews was, they had this statement at the end that research assessing the effectiveness of sedentary time reduction interventions that target the environment and organizational level and interventions that compare the effectiveness of physical activity and sedentary time interventions are needed. So I presented the one study that looked at comparing the increasing physical activity versus decreasing sedentary time. This was a good lead into the second topic that I wanted to talk about, and that's environmental barriers to increase physical activity and to decreasing sedentary behavior. So again, this is a very common topic, environmental barriers in the Journal for Physical Activity and Aging. This is a qualitative study, and I'm not a qualitative research expert, but I like this study because of the pictures. So this is from a study done in Israel, and part of the study is they actually gave older adults cameras to take pictures of what they perceived as environmental barriers to walking and environmental facilitators for walking. So these are just some of the barriers that they identified. So, holes and cracks in sidewalks, cars parking on sidewalks. Who did that, Overgrown hedges, impairing your walking down the sidewalk, broken street stairs. And then some of the facilitators, so food-related destinations, grocery stores, other shopping facilities, and then benches, where you can take resting breaks if you're on a walk. So I think about like a city like Saskatoon. They don't have any grocery stores in the downtown area. So you're forced to drive to the suburbs to go to your grocery stores. So that's just an example of just poor urban design that discourages physical activity. So again, just other barriers and facilitators, so they have like a poor condition of a statue. A facilitator, beautiful architecture. So this reminds me of downtown Winnipeg. Like a joke there. Neglected building is a barrier. You can see some other environmental barriers at the bottom here. So excess litter, overloaded garbage cans, and obviously heavy street traffic for pedestrians is a barrier. So other environmental barriers. So this is from about 10, 15 different papers published over the last few years in the journal. Lack of curb cuts, a lack of crosswalks, short walk signal times, safety. So this is one of the biggest factors, so fear of crime. Less attentive drivers, so the concerns with the increased number of drivers on their smartphones. Lack of cycling infrastructure that's forcing cyclists onto the sidewalks. Right-turning vehicles at crosswalks. Lack of snow clearing icy sidewalks. So this is from a study in Ottawa. Lack of water fountains, street lighting, so lack of street lighting, lack of green space, excess of hills, lack of stair handrails, off-leash dogs, and lack of street connectivity. For this last point, this was a very common barrier, and just I pulled up this nice figure on comparing lack of street connectivity here on the left-hand side, and then high street connectivity on the right-hand side. So probably characteristic of an older neighborhood, and this is characteristic of your modern suburb, and you can see that just the layout of the streets really discourages walking in this situation if a person wants to get from this destination to this destination. So My philosophy is that if you set out to reach your destination and you first have to start going in the opposite direction, you're probably living in not a very good neighborhood for physical activity. So that was cited as a very common barrier to walking behavior. And this is just a study I pulled out demonstrating this. This is perceived street connectivity in older adults, and this is their total weekly walking time. So just to summarize here, the third quartile and fourth quartile for highest street connectivity, they weren't different, but they were significantly different from the first quartile, so the lowest perceived street connectivity. I pulled up this study because it's got Michelle's on it, and then Liz, who gave the first talk. So this is a study specific to Winnipeg. They didn't support what I've just been talking about, so they didn't support the fact that environmental barriers can impede walking behavior, but they did find that number of steps per day was related to physical function in older adults, and also income levels. So the importance here is that for people that are older adults that are lower socioeconomic status and have poor physical function, those are the adults that are most important to target with regards to increased walking behavior. This is the only study that actually has anything to do with my talk. So this is the one study that compared sedentary behavior and they try to predict it by physical environmental factors and also individual and social factors. So this was a nice population study. So this was out of Belgium, where they looked at 51,000 older adults, and they had they were all over 65 years of age, and they had a mean age of 74.4 for this study. What I've done here is I put together a graph just showing the results of this study. So these were factors that reduced TV viewing time. So what I've got on the the x-axis down here is the number of minutes per day of reduced TV watching time based on these different factors. So if there was a high level of perceived safety, they had the most significant reduction in TV watching time. So they think if older adults perceive their neighborhood safe, they're more likely to go out walking in the evening when it's dark, and less likely to watch TV. Performing volunteer work was the next highest predictor of reduced television time. Then you have decreased loneliness, people that walked or cycled for recreation, and then if you're in close proximity to cultural facilities, so a weaker effect, increased street lighting, and increased greenery of the walking areas. And the last thing I'm going to mention here is just a recently funded CIHR study that I've been lucky enough to be involved with. So the PIs on this are Nancy Solbach from University of Toronto and Ruth Barclay from University of Manitoba. And I was able to go on this as a knowledge user through CSEP. So with regards to CSEP's perspective, we're hoping to take some of the findings from the study and incorporate it into workshops or online material for a lot of the CSEP certified members. So the aim of the study is to evaluate the effects of a one-day educational workshop and 3-month outdoor mobility program on walking activity. So the intervention in this program involves taking adults outside, older adults outside a couple of times a week in small groups with exercise leaders. So I'm trying to get them to hire some CSEP certified exercise physiologists to run the walking groups. And the intervention involves a progressively increasing difficulty to overcome environmental barriers while walking outside. And it stems from the fact that 42% of Canadian older adults rarely walk outdoors. And there's quite a good relationship of limited outdoor walking ability with frailty, lack of mobility, self-care decline, social isolation, and reduced health-related quality of life. So these are some of the outcomes that are planned for the study. So walking activity. So this is a 3-month study, but it has a 12-month follow-up. Health-related quality of life, and then some functional measures, so balance, leg strength, walking speed. So it's a multi-site study that's being done in Edmonton, Winnipeg, Toronto, Montreal. It involves 240 older adults that are either randomized to the intervention or the control group. So the intervention group involves the one-day workshop plus the outdoor walking small group leader facilitated walking program, and then the control group gets the one-day workshop, and then they get telephoned encouragement to do outdoor activity. Also, just a summary of my presentation. Older adults have the highest amount of sedentary activity of all age groups, so an important group to target for interventions to reduce sedentary activity. This is related to a large number of negative health outcomes. Built environment influences outdoor walking and may present barriers to reducing sedentary behavior. And there's definitely a lack of randomized controlled trials for improving health outcomes related to sedentary behavior in older adults. So it's definitely an important area for future research. So I'd like to acknowledge CSEP for sponsoring the group that went down to that workshop in Australia. Also CIHR for sponsoring the Go Out study. And even though I just presented one slide on this, I've put the pulse growers of Saskatchewan up here in Agriculture Canada just to tell them that I've used some of their research, because they're not very eager to give money towards health-related outcomes related to those foods. So I'm always trying to encourage them to do that. Yeah, that's it.
So again, we have time for questions, and we can start out first with questions specifically for Phil, and then we can move to more general discussion if there's any further questions. And again, please use the microphone.
Great presentation. Just wondering if you could expand more on the 1 hour of sit less time for the Gibbs study. Just what exactly were they required to do for that 1 hour of sitting less?
Yeah, so they were just, throughout the intervention, they were repeatedly counseled by exercise physiologists on reminders to reduce their 1 hour of sitting per day. So they had a number of telephone sessions and a number of in-person sessions. And then, as I mentioned, they also wore these sensor-wear armbands that tracked their physical activity and sedentary time. And that was connected to a Bluetooth that was connected to an iPhone that the participants were given, so they could get feedback throughout the day on reducing their sedentary behavior or increasing their physical activity if they were in the physical activity group. And as I mentioned, it seemed to be quite an effective intervention because they didn't have any dropouts over the intervention. And so to me, it seemed like a great intervention for an exercise physiologist. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll maybe follow up with another question about the Gibbs study. So you said the participants didn't drop out, but were participants, did they completely comply with the instructions? So was the group that was encouraged to get active, were they actually doing the 150 minutes per week?
That's a great question, Michelle, and that makes me feel like you've read the study. Bad question. So the only, I didn't mention this, but there was a limitation with their outcomes. So one of their outcomes was to see if the groups actually improved their physical activity or reduced their sedentary time. What they actually found was that both the physical activity group and the group that was counseled to sit less had increased measurements of physical activity but the sit less group did not have a significant reduction in sitting time over the study. So that was one limitation of the entire thing. But I'm looking at the intent to treat principle. They gave them these interventions. The sit less group did better when they were counseled to sit less with the health outcomes. But it was because maybe they increased their physical activity. Yeah. So that's a definite limitation. Yeah. Good question.
Okay, well, if there's no more specific questions for Phil, I just want to thank him for participating in this session.
Thanks, Michelle.
And does anyone have any questions, kind of overarching questions? I know all the work that was put into these presentations and kind of giving us a perspective of things that have been happening over the past 50 years and where do we need to go and where are we going in the future certainly has given me lots of food for thought in terms of some of the things that are happening nationally and internationally related to aging. So I'm thinking that maybe there's some work that CSEP could be prompting in terms of this. So one is at the national level, there's a study going on right now regarding a national senior strategy. And so should CSEP be making some submissions to that committee, or as that movement goes forward? I'm still not exactly sure of politically how this process is going to work. But they are right now consulting witnesses, and hopefully there will be a plan to have a national senior strategy. But it certainly seems like, based on all the research that has been done and the plethora of benefits that can be accrued from physical activity, that physical activity should be part of that national senior strategy. And then I guess the other thing that strikes me is that the World Health Organization, as many of you might be aware, has a global strategy and action plan. They're trying to encourage countries to come up with plans of action to have a decade of healthy aging from 2020 to 2030. And certainly a big part of their global strategy and action plan is improving physical function. That's the main reason for it existing. And physical function, in their minds, can be improved by two different routes. One is improving intrinsic capacity, which of course we heard a lot of the research on that. And then on top of that is also improving environment. So for those who do have intrinsic capacities that are going down, we can still allow people to maintain or maybe even improve their functional capacity by having an impact on environment. So whether it's the built environment, the social environment. Another big thing I think that might exist within all of this is the ageism. We heard about talks of the gray tsunami and burdens and cost to society, but we really need to be focused on making investments, and maybe some of those investments are around programming for physical activity. Not everyone is able to get out and walk on the sidewalks, particularly not in Winnipeg in the winter, for example. That would be a big risk to do so. So maybe it's time for CSEP to try and engage with a couple of these processes and get something onto that national strategy. So any comments, questions for the panelist? Okay, if not, I want to thank them all for all the work that they put into their presentations. They weren't just presenting on what they always present on or their current research or work, and so I can certainly see that there was a huge amount of time put into all of these presentations that hopefully we'll see some publications. I'm not sure we're recording. I'm not sure if those recordings are going to be available for others to see later, but thanks again for all the work and all your insights today. Thank you.